you might have to say a little bit about. No. That is the monitor showing the video, and that's showing if you're standing on the podium, you can see what is being broadcast. Is that Tony? If your hand's out of place?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's all ready to get worked out now. They're all fine.
You've done it.
No, we've already done. All good.
Hold on, Mel. Okay, now.
Right.
Now, are these your water bottles?
Yes, we thought we might have
So we just
water.
set it back here, do we?
Yeah, now that's just a really dangerous spot.
Where's the other?
There's one freestanding chair.
I saw that shit with that stupid one.
Yeah, that's shooting. Do you want me to put that,
Because I mean, I think we'll just sit
I'm in the
there
front row.
while we're waiting to our tag.
Okay.
But then we won't be set up.
Yeah, you can just go in there. I'll go in the other end.
Do we have a plug-on microphone, or do we?
You don't need it.
You don't
You're
need it.
speaking around
All
the
right,
lectern, and we
okay.
encourage you to speak around the lectern because then you'll be on the webcast monitor.
Okay, and you can see what's happening.
Yeah.
I see.
So sort of from here to here.
Is where you speak, where you
yeah,
stand?
that's sort of, I mean, don't get too caught up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's awful, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah, they're shocking. Are you going to be okay there, Tony?
Oh,
Okay, so
he
Now, I
behaves
think
himself
you're-
after a while. So.
I think what I might do is I'll just tag that for you so no one and,
So don't just bring it like a normal chair in?
well,
good actually.
Is that the Act 2?
the only chance you've got is the same as that one.
I think there's one for the arms.
Oh, are there? If
Oh,
there's
no,
not,
no,
if there's a
no.
regular chair,
Yeah, I think so.
that would be great.
Yeah.
Are you comfortable sitting in front of the front row?
Look,
Tony?
absolutely.
And I know that you're probably much better at finding safety hazards than I am, but just so that you know, there's an overhead projector here.
Yep.
Forward.
Yep.
I'll pull the overhead over to the side.
I'll just
now.
be going.
Well, we won't be using it.
No, I don't think anyone is.
No,
Put
no.
to the side. But
That's Jerry, isn't it?
yeah.
It is good. That's right.
Sorry.
I just don't want to say thank Pauline.
No, never call me
Jane.
Pauline.
Jane.
Very bad.
Jane.
Joe.
Joe.
Yeah.
Joe's a fiend, in fact, but we won't say that.
Joseph-
What my mother calls me when
Okay.
she's angry with me.
Okay, Josephine.
Oh yeah.
Joe's
What's your
fine.
role here?
I'm a lecturer in the Department of Political Science.
Oh yeah.
I'm a social policy person. And my interest in this stuff is in civic engagement online, so non-institutional political stuff.
Yeah.
You know, social movements and activists and everything grassrootsy.
Tony, what do you want for your? Sorry. Oh, it's just. About the way where two.
You might actually put it so that Tony's facing in like an audience member. This is the chair for when he's finished his presentation. That's all, Tony.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm looking. We'll just check the Peter and I.
Yeah.
Practice or squat. Don't want to be too far away.
Well, there's one armless chair for you.
Oh, excellent. I'm not going to what people say about you anymore.
Go.
Oh.
What are you saying about me?
Oh, nothing but good things. Can I show you what the AppStream fellows showed me? We are allowed to press the buttons that Peter said we're not allowed to.
I know that. I knew that.
Oh, you knew, okay, but you just weren't going to. So to go to the PC,
Rule number 1 about technology is you only tell people what you know when they want to hear it.
it's on you. So you go, and then it's on the laptop at the moment. If we want to change over to the PC, we just press PC, and then we have to press this. So that that's lit up, that's so that AppStream on. And then if we want to go to the laptop,
Laptop.
well, we've got to make, yeah. Sorry, I'm sure it's extremely simple to you.
Yeah, but it's simple, but it's exactly what Peter didn't say.
Yeah.
He was talking about that silly laptop preview that I told him it wasn't. But
Yeah.
fine, I won't tell you.
No, I told him. You told us to press the wrong button. But I said it nicely, so he didn't feel like
Making a quick photo of you too, if you don't mind. Yeah, right there, good.
Casual, just
all right, that's fine.
casual.
Yeah, fine.
Casual chatting.
Yeah.
Casual get stylish.
Blah, 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 blah. Perfect.
So now at the end of your session, Is the technology just going to sit there until the end?
I will shut it down so that you don't get that up there.
Well, you won't. That's not a problem. We'll just flick to the PC, and the PC screens will
Then
just come up.
I will just close the lid.
Okay, and we'll just leave it there until
just
the end
leave
of
it
the
there to
session.
the end. Oh, you don't muck around. It's
Good stuff.
Fabulous. So have you got a foot?
I have a foot.
Hey,
I've had
you
a
got a
foot for
vacuum?
about 6 years.
Get a vacuum bag.
Yeah.
Oh, wouldn't mind a
I have a
vacuum
foot in sociology.
bag.
Yeah.
It's interesting a lot of this. I mean, now who was that bloke who just came to talk? Bruce was last night?
Timber.
Timber.
Yeah, he's an academic at University of California, Santa Barbara. Hello. You presenting now?
Yes, I'm Margaret.
Oh, hi, Mark. These guys are using technology. So I'm going to run this session first, and then bump the other two back.
There's 22 minutes.
Okay. I've got this little card. I'll just clean up that. And I've got.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm not sure.
I'm going to do that in my
Excellent.
If you go over, it's a couple of minutes, I won't mind, but I'll start going.
Experience of the last one.
Well, yeah, if it's acceptable to all the speakers, the way I've been doing it in my sessions is give people an opportunity to ask specific questions after each presentation, and then open the floor. Just I find if you leave all the questions to people, I now yeah, that's right. So that way you get everyone. And have you got technology? Have you got a card?
So if you need me, you want me just to hand test things well, is that a problem?
No, it all works. It's up there, so it works. So, no, that's fine. I appreciate your help on that.
It's completely uncomplicated. We've got one additional technological thing to think about in this session. But either Matt or I will need to bring up the PowerPoint presentation. Has already loaded his presentation on his desktop, and I'm assuming that
Double check that. Assumptions can be lethal.
well, they can be, except when you work with Peter Chen, where you can guarantee that there is absolutely nothing that has, no stone has been left
I've
unturned.
spoken to him this morning and he didn't say anything about. I sent it through to him and he acknowledged it and he didn't say anything this morning about there being a problem.
A bit of a pedant, isn't he?
Beyond,
Not that one.
in the nicest possible way.
Absolutely.
Is
My computer.
is there a disc in there?
Should be. Under new, yeah. Day 2.
There we go.
Hopefully one of
So
those.
what's it called?
A comparative analysis of anything?
Keeping
Electronic information
probably
accessible.
that one. Probably that one.
Is that you?
Yep.
Great. So that's all just sitting there waiting to go. That's a bit weird.
Click cancel. That's number 2, isn't it?
What is that?
I'm not sure, but I would suggest we don't change it because I think that's the second PowerPoint.
Oh, right, okay.
In case they've changed it for some reason, we don't want to muck with it.
But that's a bit weird. I'll just minimise it. That's fine. Okay, so we'll just... Great. Go, go, go. And, I actually just run tutorial sessions with new tutors on principles of effective teaching, and I say important educational device. It's also very good to stop and to reflect. It gives you that pause. It's a very interesting point. Very nice. Yeah, good idea. Yeah, well, I go to loads of options.
The problem with mixing the water with the high tech is that if you spill the water in the laptop, and your laptop is usually a bit compromised.
It's a bit of a dynamo, is it? A bit of a cup and that's it.
It was on the smart.
Oh yeah, we turned it off because it shows you while you're speaking, and we find that that's very distracting.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Wouldn't want to win. Wouldn't want to win.
No. That's not nice. You can wax.
That's right, that's right.
But yeah, it's a good device if you're doing like if you're giving a lecture and you know you've got sound through it, but it's a bad device for conference actually. You're meant to be able to free form of it.
It would be a good device if you were getting a lecture or giving a lecture.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And oh, how creepy.
Yes, but you wouldn't have to, good to review, not perhaps not.
Yeah, do what I say, not what I do.
That's going to be interesting section.
Well, this will be the fourth session on Tuesday, and one of the three I did yesterday was Friday. It was in the afternoon, in the water policy that was lecture in three. That regional. It was one action research project by Adrian, but on the regional, and then a practitioner presentation from the golf in so we're doing some really interesting work using technology as an aid and the tools that are very iconic. That was really cool. And then at the end there was an interesting academic paper. There wasn't, in terms of programming, there wasn't a clear link between it, but they were really good. And this was about political parties and their system. These guys at IMU had actually used a crawler on the web to work out the links between political parties and external sites of information. And they found that the left parties, so the small parties, are much more connected, and the right parties are much more inwardly focused. Quite interesting.
So right being conservative.
Yeah, well, they used actually the electoral tradition definition the Democratic Social Party is right.
Does that mean they're more right than the other left-wing parties?
Yeah, maybe.
Oh, look, that's left and right these days. I mean, is it right? It's left and right or left?
Oh, yeah, it's a difficult blurred line. I think our parties are actually much more left-wing than the US, but
Yes, I think so.
are actually quite right-wing.
Well,
The Republicans more so, but even the Democrats, who are supposed to be the left-wing party.
The party tends to be colour. Oh, excuse me.
Good morning, everybody. I'm chairing this session, and in order to accommodate my technological ineptitude, we've just reversed the order of speakers. So up first, we've got Tony. Sorry, I'm now trying to play from my detail program. Tony Clark and Peter Abbinga, who are talking about enabling an independent empowered participation in the electronic democratic process by people with disabilities. For those of you who've been in sessions I've chaired before, the way I do it is give people an opportunity to ask a couple of questions of each specific speaker after their talk, and then open the floor at the end for more questions of all speakers. So we'll hand over to Tony and Peter.
Thank you very much, Joe. What will happen is I'll give a presentation, Peter will come in, and then I'll wrap things up. What we're really hoping to get out of today's presentation is perhaps change the focus a little bit from what probably to date has been a fairly largely theoretical discussion, and start looking at some practical applications about how the electronic environment can now provide true independent and empowered participation for individuals that to date have been reasonably marginalised within the democratic process. When we talk about democratic process, we're talking within the Australian context. Now, if we look at the democratic process, I think it's important to perhaps get some understanding of perhaps some of the fundamentals of the Australian democratic process. Within our constitution and legislation, everybody has the right to cast a secret and independent vote within a normal electoral process, within both Commonwealth, state and local government, and also within the other broader voting things such as board elections, etc. Formal votes must be cast on a print piece of paper, and that's a requirement at this stage, and that's a legislative requirement. So it means that somebody must actually complete a ballot paper to make it count within the process. And basically the last point, which is also very important in the Australian context, is that there's a requirement that everybody who is eligible to vote, votes. And that's actually a very important point, because if that's a legislative requirement, then that also makes it incumbent upon the government to provide an environment that people can actually fulfil that legislation and cast a secret ballot vote. Now, the reality is that there are a number of marginalised groups that cannot participate independently within the voting process. If we look at it, the barriers to the process at this point are that it assumes that people can can read print-based information. They can actually see it to read it, and therefore make an informed and independent decision. It assumes that individuals can manipulate the tools required to fill in that ballot paper, so that the vote then becomes formal and is actually counted. And it also assumes that people can understand the information that's provided. So it's a bit more than just seeing. It's about actually being able to interpret the information that is provided. While they might be able to see it, they may not be able to interpret it. So if we want to now look at perhaps those marginalised communities, who are we actually talking about? And there are a number. I'm going to focus predominantly on those who have disabilities. Although as I go through, you'll start to see that it actually does include more than that. But if we look at some Australian Bureau of Statistics figures, 19% of the population have a disability. So it's a significant part of our population. Now, one of the issues around disability that is experienced not only in Australia but internationally is that we continually try and place disability within a medical framework. So we break people down into specific medical groups, rather than actually look at what are the functional needs of those individuals. And that's really important. So if we start to do that, we can then look at one of those needs, which we'll term as a print disability. So those that have you can classify those who have print disability include a broad number of people. They'll include those who are blind and vision impaired, can't actually see the information in the way it's presented. Those who have a physical disability, a broad range of people again. That can include people who have, for example, arthritis, Parkinson's, may be an amputee. They physically can't manipulate the print-based information or the information that's presented in a text form to them. Those who have literacy difficulties, again, an increasing, as we're discovering, an increasing part of our community, those that have difficulty reading. And of course those who speak English but not read written English. And that is largely consists of those who come from a non-English speaking background. They may verbally speak English very, very well, but when it comes to reading it, they have very, very poor abilities in that area. And of course there's acquired brain injury. So of course an injury might be such as a stroke, a trauma such as a road accident, which gives them brain damage, which while they might be able to see or hear, there's a process difficulty that occurs and therefore prevents them from actually accessing print-based information. Now what I'd like to do is hand it over to Peter, who will take it on from here.
Thanks, Tony. Now, my background was originally in the Electoral Commission. I worked for 13 years with the Victorian Electoral Commission. And I think that the main message that we're trying to get across here is that really there is a recognition, particularly in the last few years, by electoral authorities throughout Australia, that really there is a big challenge facing us to actually bring into the political system and allow access and participation to large numbers of people who have previously been marginalised. And when you think about it, here in Victoria in the 1850s, we invented the secret ballot. And it went all over the world. We gave the world the secret ballot, and yet, in 2004, there are literally thousands of people who can't use the secret ballot. Now, you might say, well, okay, they can use it because someone can fill their ballot paper out for them, but that's not the same, is it? I mean, in our consultations that we've had with various groups, they've said, well, look, you know, I'm blind, my husband fills in my ballot paper for me, I don't really know how he votes. He votes differently than me, I don't know what he does. Or younger people who say, I don't want my parents to fill in my ballot paper for me. Now, isn't that just a very basic, fundamental human right? And really, the society as a whole, and certainly electoral commissions, are thinking seriously about, well, what can we do about this? And the answer, I'm pleased to say, is we can do something about it, and something has already been done, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. The gist of our message, and it's coming through from all the presentations that we've had around this conference, is this explosion in the capacity of new technologies to provide all sorts of new methods of communication and new methods of actually actioning things. And this is what people with disabilities have definitely found, that in their normal lives, the day-to-day lives, they're able to use technologies to make their lives better and to be able to do and participate and access and so on. So why not in elections? Now, the two elections I'd like to talk about, one is the ACT election, the recent one for the Legislative Assembly election, and basically what we're saying is the two challenges are to improve access and participation, but also to provide more methods of voting, a practical, simple thing, more methods of voting. So let's have a look at the two elections which give us some strategies for actually doing this. All right, so the first one was the recent ACT election, and In late 1999, Elections ACT, which is the electoral authority there, publicly advertised for proposals to develop a computerised voting system for the upcoming election. After reviewing overseas and local experience and research, Elections ACT decided that security concerns precluded the implementation of online voting via the internet. So the design brief limited development to a secure remote system. And I think here's another area where we're a bit different in our approach to what the rest of the conference is talking about in terms of electronic governance and electronic voting. We take a much broader definition of what electronic voting is. Electronic voting for electoral authorities, I think it's fair to say, would be voting using any kind of electronic device. So it's not just online voting. All right, so from the very beginning, Elections ACT consulted widely with stakeholders, including members of Parliament, party representatives and a number of community disability groups, and attempted to sort of get out there and find out, well, what are the needs, what can be done. The Commission formed a reference group to advise and provide feedback on the project. The input and the feedback from the consultations and the reference group proved to be invaluable in informing the development and the later review of what they called EVACS, the Electronic Voting and Counting System. So at the election, EVACS was trialled in a controlled environment restricted to 4 out of the 12 pre-poll centres in 2 of the 3 weeks leading up to election day and at 8 polling places on election day. So they didn't introduce it whole as bolus, they introduced it as a trial first. And you'll find that in any innovations in the electoral procedures, electoral authorities will always trial them first. They'll do it very gradually because it's extremely important to get public acceptance, because the whole basis of the integrity of the political system hinges on the election not being disputed. Now, the system was based on using standard personal computers as voting terminals, with voters using a barcode to authenticate their votes. The voting terminals were linked to a server in each voting centre using a secure local area network. No votes were taken or transmitted over the internet, so we're not talking about an online system. Recorded audio instructions were accessed through the use of earphones, which enabled people with a print disability to navigate through the voting process. So EVACS thus provided the first opportunity for people with print disabilities to vote independently because they no longer needed to physically read or mark printed ballot papers. The system was further enhanced by providing the option of choosing on-screen instructions in 12 different languages. And you can see on the screen there that facility was quite an enhancement. The system was very user-friendly, as it invited the voter to press any key to hear a description of what the key did, and each function key was labelled with a tactile label indicating the action that it performed. The system was programmed to automatically number candidates as they were selected by the voter, thus effectively eliminating the accidental casting of an informal vote due to mistakes made to the numerical sequencing. Now, of course, the unique nature of the Australian political system is the fact that we use preferential voting, and that presents some significant challenges, as you can appreciate, to any form of electronic voting, and it also presents challenges to people actually filling out the vote correctly. So one of the things we found, and we'll see this in a minute, was that by introducing electronic voting in the form that it was, our informal voting was actually much improved. So the system was programmed to automatically number candidates as they were selected by the voter, thus effectively eliminating the accidental casting of an informal vote due to mistakes made in the numerical sequence. I think I've read that bit. Pressing the finish button resulted in the voter's choices being read out in numerical order. The voter could now confirm their vote by swiping their barcode, or they could return the ballot paper and correct any errors. Right. An interesting feature of the system was that, and they did market research after and during the election, that the proportion of informal votes cast by voters using the electronic voting system was far less than those cast on paper ballots. Only 0.57% of all the votes cast electronically, so half of 1%, were informal, compared with 4.47 informal paper ballots. So 4 times as many informal votes using paper ballots. This indicated the capacity of electronic voting to significantly reduce disenfranchisement of voters that occurs due to unintentional errors made during the voting process. Now remember, this was an option available to everyone in a limited number of centres. The system was, you could still vote on paper ballots if you wanted to, but if you wanted to have a crack at the computers, you can vote using the computers. And as the electorate ages, as younger people come into the electorate, more and more, they're more confident using computers, so you'll get a bigger proportion of people actually wanting to do an electronic vote. And of course, electronic voting, as you can see, has enormous additional characteristics that advantage the electoral system. Well, the outcomes. A total of 16,559 electronic votes were recorded at the 4 pre-poll centres and at the 8 polling places. Now, while it's not possible to determine how many of these electronic votes were cast using the audio facility, because it's a secret ballot, remember, market research conducted during the conduct of the polling found that the feedback from those voters, and I'm quoting here directly from their report, feedback from those voters who commented on using it was very positive. I'd like to share some thoughts now on the state election, the Victorian state election in 2002, which Tony and I worked on. The interesting thing that comes out of this is an actual strategy of how do you maximise the effectiveness of implementing these kinds of innovations. In late 2000, the Victorian Electoral Commission, the VEC, called for public submissions on how it could improve its delivery of electoral services to people with special needs. After reviewing the submissions from a number of individuals and peak disability service providers, the Commission conducted an extensive program of public consultations and developed a disability action plan which was implemented at the election. An important strategy outlined in the plan was for the Commission to partner with a leading community service provider. So accordingly, the VEC entered into a partnership with the Vision Australia Foundation, which was formerly called the Victorian Association for the Blind, a fairly large organisation, to provide disability services and to establish 4 special early voting centres at Vision Australia premises during the election. Now, by actually locating the special early voting centres in Vision Australia premises, it meant that additional voting options could be provided by using the centre's specialised facilities. The centre's services were publicised through the Vision Australia's extensive client network, so we immediately drew in a really effective way of targeting particular groups of people that we wanted to target with electoral information through their client network by personal contact, community newsletters, audio tapes, and on their radio station 3RPH, Radio Print Handicapped. At the 4 centres, voters were able to complete their ballot papers by using a range of specialised tools, many of which were electronic, of course. such as enhanced lighting and closed circuit television for print magnification. So people with vision impairment could actually get a ballot paper, and because in electoral legislation of Victoria and all the rest of Australia too, the schedule of the Act specifies exactly what size and what print font and so on is going to be used on the ballot papers. They're that big, as you know. Some people need to enhance that. We can't actually make bigger ballot papers, and anyhow that would take away the secrecy of the vote. But you can provide for print magnification because the electronic equipment exists to enable it. And of course these centres had that equipment and had the people who could assist voters with using it. So they're able to use closed circuit television for print magnification. As well as that, we took the same sort of, I think, innovative lateral thinking approach, and we developed Braille ballot paper templates with the boxes cut out and the Braille text on the template. And this enabled the Braille readers to vote independently for the very first time in Australia. Well, yeah, in Australia. As well as this, the polling officials at these 4 centres were recruited and trained by the Commission from the Vision Australia volunteers who were familiar with the needs of the vision impaired voters. Now, the actual outcome of all this was the VEC in their report to Parliament on the 2002 election, and I'll just quote directly what they've said here, the strategy of partnering with a peak service provider such as Vision Australia proved to be very successful, and the trial demonstrated that the strategy has considerable potential for expansion in the future. So just before I hand it back to Tony, I think it's fair to say that the success both of the computer voting in the ACT and the special early voting centres in Victoria indicates that a fruitful strategy for the future might be to establish a number of strategically located, what we call comprehensive voting centres, specialised centres, where voters can choose from the widest possible range of voting options, including the use of special tools, adaptive technology, closed circuit television and computer voting in all its manifestations. So when we talk about electronic voting, we not only mean online voting via the internet, we also mean local area networks and remote systems. We mean the use of closed circuit television, any kind of electronic device. Telephone voting is another possibility, and so on. There are numerous. And I think that it's best summed up by the Victorian Electoral Commissioner, Colin Barry, who looks at it in terms of, in the past we've provided only one door into the voting system. Now we need to provide lots of additional doors. And people can just decide which of the doors they want to enter to go in to vote. So thanks, Tony.
One of the good things about not seeing is I can't see Joe just gesticulating me to hurry up. You can tap as much as you like. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, now just to perhaps sum things up. What are the benefits to the Electoral Commission from this sort of approach? And the approach I'm talking about is, as Peter indicated, providing that superstore type environment where people can choose the options that are going to best meet their needs. Basically, in taking a community partnership, you get access to specialist expertise. With any work environment, particularly the standard environment, there is a real lack of understanding of what the needs for people who are different and those marginalised communities. In working with community groups, you can actually get that expertise which can feed in to substantially improving the outcome, and rather than take perhaps best guess, you're actually starting to make some well-informed and considered decisions. You've got access to specialist facilities, facilities that have been purpose-built, are going to be absolutely accessible, rather than perhaps consistently relying on the old school, where while the school is accessible, the hall that it's in, and actually the only access is through steps. Information, particularly when we look at the EVACS system, information can be rendered in many different ways. And really, that is the essence of accessibility. Accessibility is about providing options. We only have to think of ourselves. We will take up access information on what best suits our needs at the time. There is a substantial reduction in formal voting, times 20 in effect, from 0.5% to 4.7%. That's a lot. And that really does indicate that people, certainly a conclusion that could be drawn from that is that people are actually making, and their decisions are actually counting perhaps, when perhaps previously they're not. And of course, it's a secure environment. We're not talking about online, we're talking about an environment that would be controlled by the Electoral Commission, whether that be electronic or the actual physical environment. So what are the benefits to the community? They're rather obvious in many ways. Individuals, for the first time, many individuals will be able to cast a secret ballot and a secret vote without hoping that their wife, husband, friend is filling in the ballot paper correctly on their behalf. And really, when you think about it, it was only 100 years ago that it was legislated that blind people could actually vote. So it wasn't that long that blind people were just not allowed to participate. And that's also applied to people with other disabilities. People can utilise the options that best suit their needs. So they can walk in and they can make their choice on their own terms, as opposed to where now there are no choices. And of course, I think a fundamental is that this sort of approach, perhaps for the first time, starts to really recognise the fact that we can no longer consider ourselves to live in a white Anglo-Saxon, able-bodied English community. It's not. We are actually in a very diverse community with people who have diverse needs and diverse requirements. And of course, very, very importantly, it maintains dignity. The individual concerned, which is a very, very difficult thing to put a price on. So in conclusion to our presentation, did you say something? Quickly! Oh, okay, sorry. It's consistent with federal and state legislation, this sort of approach. It certainly meets the needs of the disability and complies and is consistent with the Disability Discrimination Act, so equity is maintained. It provides an active link to work and link in with community needs, so that the services are provided are consistent, they're meaningful, and they change in line with what the community requirements are. And of course, they've vastly improved electoral outcomes. And I think really the biggest thing to come out of this particular sort of strategy and benefits is the fact that we're moving away from perhaps being a technologically driven thing to remembering that it's a human component. That is the human that interfaces with the electronic, not the other way around. And if we keep that in mind, then we're going to deliver a very effective system. And finally, just to thank, just a couple of recognitions, just like to thank Phil Green and Alison Purvis from Elections ACT, Colin Barry from the Victorian Electoral Commission, and of course Carol Broughton from Software Improvements for the Screen Guns. Thank you very much. You can stop panicking.
You got away with it, then.
I'm sorry, blame him, it's his fault.
Thank you very much for that. Has anyone got any specific questions of Tony and Peter at the moment? Yes?
Can you still vote informally if you wish to?
Yes.
On the computer, but
The right to vote informally is electronic.
You can still cast a donkey.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Absolutely.
Anyone else? I have a question, or maybe a challenge, about the conclusion that you've drawn about the informal voting, given the what you outlined with the ACT experience. Because there was self-selection, people could choose to use the computer, so the electronic version or the print version. Did you have a way of controlling for, that issue of self-selection? Because the self-selecting group to use the technology is not necessarily representative of all the communities. Do you
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, in short, no, there was no way to determine that. I mean, that is perhaps a conclusion you could draw, and you would never be able to sort of get the true figure unless you all went electronic.
Yeah, that's
that's the only way you can 100% guarantee that. But certainly, sort of based on the feedback, again, I mean, you're drawing conclusions perhaps, but I think that there's their reason.
I think just to briefly add to that, I mean, the whole purpose of the trial was to find out whether it would work, how it would work, what was good about it, what was bad about it, what do we need to fix, that sort of thing. It was only a trial. But when you get the full-blown system, those sorts of issues will have to be considered.
Just something that I've noticed from research that I've done is that people who are print literate are more likely to be technologically literate. So the technologically literate, based on research that I've done, would be more likely to be literate and less likely to cast an informal vote.
I'd agree with that, and that's why we're advocating this strategy of community involvement. So if they go into the centres, for example, the Vision Australia centres, they're familiar with those centres, and they're much more comfortable dealing with the people that they deal with normally during the day, who then assist them to maybe sit down in front of the computer. So it takes into account that very point.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. It was a great presentation. We'll have more questions at the end. And I'm just going to do the technological change, and then I'll introduce Tim. Now, is this your one here, Tim? I'll leave it to you. And I'd just like to introduce Tim Arnold-Moore, who's going to be talking about public access to legislation and the democratic process.
Thank you, Joe. I'm going to start my presentation with a couple of pieces of governance of my own, declaring some interests and so on. And I'm going to talk a bit about why legislation is different and why it needs careful treatment compared with other pieces of information that governments or other organisations might provide to people electronically or in paper form. And then I'm going to talk a bit about some a phrase which seems to be very popular amongst government here in Victoria about world's best practice to do with presenting legislation and related material to the community. I'm going to talk a little bit about point-in-time access to legislation, about XML or SGML as an enabling technology, and about providing change markup. And I'll explain that term a little later, relating to representing how legislation is changing and providing the information of what's changed to the public. My declaration of interest is that I work for and own shares in a company that produces legislation management and delivery technology. So when I push for a better quality legislation delivery, I have a financial interest in governments actually doing that, I guess. The company I work for is Inquirion. It's a spin-off from RMIT University. We produce an ACT system for the Tasmanian Parliamentary Council Office, and we've also delivered systems to drafting offices in Papua New Guinea, the federal government in Canada, New South Wales, and some consulting services to Ontario and most recently New Zealand. Another area of governance that I wanted to speak on, there's been, in the first sessions yesterday, there was a lot of discussion about the utopian Athenian democracy, which many people have wished to return to. I just wanted to point out, and I've got a quote up here. Sorry, I haven't reproduced this for those of you who are print disabled. Let me read it out to you. The Assembly embraced all male citizens over the age of 18, a group of probably about 43,000 in the 440s, that's 440 BC. But a quorum of only 6,000 seems to have been needed at its sessions. These were held several times a month on the slopes of the Pnyx, north of the Acropolis. Since women, slaves and foreigners were excluded, a very small part of the 300,000 odd residents of Attica determined public policy. So the Athenian utopia was actually quite restricted to 43,000 eligible voters, and in fact on most votes a very small proportion of that 43,000 actually voted because they voted several times a month and you had to be wealthy enough to hang around in the agora to cast your vote. But the concept is nice and the ideal is nice to talk about. So what's different about legislation? Well, with legislation there's an obligation to publish. Now, this obligation to publish is not often widely acknowledged, but inherent in our Australian Constitution and in constitutions of most Anglo-American jurisdictions, there are really three arms of government. There's the legislative arm, which is required to publish legislation and bills in order for members of Parliament and also for the citizens to have an informed contribution to the legislative process. Now, when it all boils down to it, the product of our government and what determines how government acts is legislation. The legislature exists to produce legislation. The executive arm exists to execute the wishes of Parliament in administering the legislation, and the judicial arm exists to make binding decisions about the application of that legislation. That's a slightly simplistic view, but legislation is fundamental to how our government works. If you go into a typical government department office, many of the bureaucrats there will be determining exactly what they do, when and how by legislation, whether it be primary legislation or delegated legislation. Therefore, in order to participate in government effectively, we need access to legislation. So if government has a responsibility to publish that legislation to us, the question is which mechanism should they use to distribute it to us? In the past, they've used either government printers producing just print versions of the legislation and not making it accessible to those of us who aren't able to make use of print. But they've also used commercial publishers and universities and non-profit organisations. There is also the issue of when government does its own publishing, whether it should be the legislature itself that publishes legislation, whether it should be the executive, whether it should be the drafting office, whether they belong to the executive or the legislature or have some independent life, or whether it should be the courts. I would argue that while it's appropriate for government to provide legislation through commercial publishers and non-profits, that they actually have an obligation to provide an authoritative source of legislation, and that probably the most appropriate place to do that is the drafting office, because the drafting office has to maintain legislation. And I'll get into that a little further when I talk about the sorts of things that should be published. Another unique characteristic of legislation is, at least in Anglophone jurisdictions, that it has a quite complex and very consistent structure. In Anglophone jurisdictions, they follow the drafting tradition of the Chancellor of the Exchequer in England, a tradition which was started sort of in the 17th, 18th century. All acts and most subordinate legislation is made up of a number of sections, variously called clauses, orders, etc., in subordinate legislation. And these sections are all grouped in sort of grouping structures such as chapters, parts, divisions, subparts, etc. And the sections themselves are divided into subsections and definitions and paragraphs and so on. And paragraph means something very different in legislation to what we would normally use the word paragraph. And in civil jurisdictions we have a similar structure but slightly less uniform, following the Napoleonic tradition. So there's this consistent structure in legislation which is unique to government information. Another quite important distinction is that legislation is frequently amended. And in most, in fact nearly all, Anglo-American jurisdictions, about 80% of legislation is not actually creating new law, it's making textual changes to the existing law. That is, an act will say, Section 5 of the Principal Act is amended by omitting paragraph A and inserting the following paragraph. And you'll get a litany of hundreds of those textual changes which you apply to the existing text of the legislation to produce a new version. And each of these changes comes into effect at a nominated time. So over time you get multiple versions of the legislation. But most users don't care about that sort of plumbing language, as it's called by drafting officers. They care about the actual substantive law that is the result of applying those textual changes. So for litigation and advice about prior events, what the user requires is access to the whole amended text as it was at the time that event took place. So they're looking back in time to a previous version. When people are drafting legislation, or whether they're considering the effect of new proposed amendments, or when their lawyer is providing them advice about future activity, they want the latest version of the text and almost certainly information about what the legislature is likely to do to change that text in the near future. Ideally, they'd like the version of the legislation in 10 years' time, but to the extent that you can't predict what Parliament's going to do, that's not possible. Of course, in a Westminster system, we can predict Parliament a lot more than we can in, say, a US type situation. Now, I'm afraid the next slide is very pictorial, but I'll do my best to explain it. What I'm basically describing here is if we have three acts, an original act and two subsequent amending acts, we can commence different parts of the legislation at different times. So if I have an original act, I can commence sections 1 and 2 at the time the act comes into force, and sections 3 and 4 commence at a time slightly in the future, and section 5 commences at a time far into the future. I can have an intervening amending act which amends section 3 and does a minor textual amendment, and a subsequent amendment which amends section 5 way into the future that does a more substantive amendment. And if I do that, I have to change the table of contents to represent that change. Sorry, I've got timings on these, so they're not displaying properly. And then if I have a subsequent amending act, I can retrospectively amend to eliminate section 4. And this is actually a real example. The section numbers have been changed to protect the innocent. But there are actually examples, and usually in the most complicated and politically sensitive legislation like tax legislation or gaming legislation, where you get these very complex interactions of commencements. Now, when this happens, I won't explain the animation. So when this happens, you get a very complicated situation that's very hard to display on paper. But it's actually reasonably easy to display electronically. There are other differences which I won't go into here, but my paper refers to them, and that will be available shortly. So, given that complicated sort of change history, what is the world's best practice in terms of presenting this information to the world? Well, I would argue that the world's best practice in terms of presenting consolidations is to make electronic consolidations available to people. Now, this was first done in electronic form in New South Wales in 1980. Way, way, way ahead of anywhere else in the world as far as I'm aware. It was WordPerfect documents that were very, very ugly and looked nothing like the printed page, but they were accessible in the sense that the text of the legislation was there and could be made available to those people who were unable to use the printed form. Subsequent to that, in 1997, 3 jurisdictions, all in the same year, coincidentally, made available to the public the ability to search and browse legislation at a selected time. This is what I call pointed time legislation. That means to be able to navigate into the past and into the future by selecting a date and being able to navigate within that date what the statute book looked like at that time point. That means navigating hypertext links to other pieces of legislation that were versions at that particular time. And also, in 3 of those 4 cases, to navigate to as-made legislation to see the amendment that caused the change. Those jurisdictions were Tasmania, Hong Kong and Singapore. The first 2, Tasmania and Hong Kong, made it available for free on the web. Singapore still charges for it. Going back to the paper world, making available on-demand paper consolidations. As far as I'm aware, the only jurisdiction that does this, even today, is Tasmania. You can walk into the government printer's office and ask for a consolidation as of the 1st of January 2003. And they will print for you a consolidation as of the 1st of January 2003. Now, I might just skip over that, but just to illustrate the point of consolidation is that obviously there are a number of different versions available of this Act at a particular time, and depending on what time point you select, you will get different versions of the different pieces of the legislation. In order to manage that effectively, you need to manage the time points of the individual fragments. I have an example of the current Tasmanian website, which is about to change, I think, in the next 2 days to a new look and feel. Basically, what one can do is enter a date, search on the legislation and get the version as of that date, and then navigate to subsequent versions. So if we flick between these two versions, you can see. And I'm sorry they're screen grabs, so they don't, the text won't be available for them. But if you want to have a look at the time point of legislation, if you go to www.thelaw, as one word, .tas.gov.au, you can interact with the system and see how that works. Another aspect of legislation, providing legislation in accessible formats, is the ability to provide structured markup. Now, instead of representing the typographic hints like describing that a headnote to a section should be in 12-point Roman boldface, the idea behind using XML or SGML is to describe it simply using tags that mark it as a headnote and to allow the repurposing application of a style sheet to describe how it should look. Now, this has a number of advantages in allowing repackaging and repurposing by other departments, both in paper form and in electronic form, and in forms yet unimagined. It allows the government to provide to its own departments the ability to republish the legislation with annotations about how the department might interpret that legislation. And it also allows commercial publishers and non-government organisations like Osley and Bailey and so on to republish that information effectively and at a low cost to them to translate it into their own look and feel. So it allows single source publication of things like paper pamphlets, paper artefacts like annual volumes and indexes from a single source rather than somebody having to manually compile them. It allows the production of electronic HTML and, God forbid, PDF that would allow people to view things online and produce paper rather than having to go down to a government printer's shop. And it also facilitates point in time, because when you represent the logical structure of a document rather than its presentation, you can break it up into pieces really easily. When you mark a section as a section, when you go to delete the section, it's already identified for you. You don't have to use some sort of typographic marker to try and find the end of the section. Which brings me to my final point about XML, is that it supports automation. And the ability to automate consolidation and automate the production of amendment wording has been available and in use in Tasmania since 1997. There are a couple of jurisdictions in Canada that are using semi-automated consolidation, Quebec, the Department of Justice in Canada, and apart from those two jurisdictions, I'm unaware of anybody using anything vaguely approaching automated consolidation. Another aspect that's important for access is access to timely information in order to affect the process of production of legislation. So, for instance, The Victorian government in 1996 introduced a system for bills which allowed the bill status to be updated directly from the floor and published to their website within minutes of the decision being made on the floor. And that happened in 1996. There are still very few jurisdictions in the world doing that. I think there are a number of US states that do it as well. For the US federal government, I guess you have to watch C-SPAN. But the bill status information is all very well, but if you can't actually see the content of the bill, that doesn't help very much. One of the things that a number of jurisdictions have done a lot of work with is providing consolidated bills, that is, bills that have been modified by select committees or committee of the whole, being the whole of the legislature sitting as a committee, providing the effect of those changes as they were voted in or voted against immediately. In paper, they are available in Canada and New Zealand the next day without fail, even if the people who produce them have to work on them night and day. In theory, electronically, they could be available immediately, although we're still waiting for a jurisdiction to actually do that. But it does bring to mind a couple of possibilities, but I don't have time to really go into them. The Minnesota legislature also projects on screen the bill clause by clause for the legislatures to interact with, and they've been doing that since 1998. There are a couple of other US states that have followed that example. Another important aspect of bills, particularly, is the ability to show the effect of amendments. New Zealand is particularly good at this, and they have a very interactive select committee process. Every bill going through the New Zealand Parliament, without exception, goes through select committees, which is very unusual in the Westminster system, because usually we don't like things to be changed publicly, we change them behind closed doors. The New Zealand process, by contrast, is very open. You can ring somebody or contact somebody who's on the select committee and actually influence the text of the bill as it's going through the process, and that happens frequently. So even government bills that have the support of the majority government will get changed on the floor as they go through the process. That is democracy in action. It's important to be able to make those changes and track those changes. In New Zealand, they actually provide layers of change markup with strike through and underline to allow you to see whether something was decided by a majority or unanimously by the select committee and by the committee of the whole, and to distinguish between decisions of the select committee and the committee of the whole. Okay, I've got some examples of some other legislation here, but I won't go into them because I've run out of time. Instead, I'll just finish with a quote from Tom McMahon, who's in the Policy Division of the Justice Department in Canada. The cost of publishing the law is a cost of democracy. Democracy has certain inherent costs that must be borne by the entire society for the benefit of society. Publication of the law should not be seen as an optional expense, as government's proprietary information should not fall into a user pay model. So, people have some questions.
Question over here from Frank.
Just a comment, really. You said quite rightly that good reason for the publishing legislation is to enable people to participate in the process if they want to. But I think there's a more fundamental reason for publishing it, and that is because we're all expected to comply with the law, and then we get into strife if we can break it. It's sort of fundamental to that process that you should be able to know what the law is. And that's what I see as I guess, the basic reason why you publish legislation.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons why you publish legislation. I could have gone into more detail in my paper. That's certainly one of them. Yes, the ignorance of the law is no excuse means that if you can't find the law, then you shouldn't have to obey it. And in fact, in Victoria, if you can't find a version of the law, you don't have to obey it. If subordinate legislation is not available in either the Parliamentary Library or the Government Bookshop at the same time, then you don't have to obey it.
Maybe you're being webcast across the world.
There is a slightly less powerful law in California, and I think the ACT also has a similar law as well. It is an excellent law.
Yeah, I'm just curious, like you gave some examples of how these sorts of processes are being used in Parliament and in the process of actually passing laws.
Yes.
I work on a project where we actually provide young people with access to amendments and bills and laws as they're being drafted. And I'm just wondering whether you know of any jurisdictions that use these sorts of electronic ways of doing that. I mean, at the moment, all we do is provide them with access to here's the paper bill. Like, here's where you can download and print table one, here's where you can print and download the discussion paper.
Yeah, ideally you want to involve people before things get to Parliament. And in fact, the culture of drafting officers in the Anglo-American tradition is that they are providing a legal advice to a client, and therefore their advice is privileged, and they guard the secrets very closely until such time as they become public documents. And it's rare, although often documents will be released as a public discussion document, and because that's ad hoc, it doesn't happen very well. But the first reading is the point where you release something publicly, and between first reading and second reading is when that public consultation is supposed to happen. But you can actually have as little as 10 minutes between first reading and second reading. Which jurisdiction is this? Queensland. Wow. Excellent.
So one more question here, and then we'll get other people to ask questions later on as well if they want.
I know you said that it's like accessible legislation. Is there any kind of website or something that makes it easy to read? Or something? Like I do law at uni and I read them and go, oh, I don't understand it. How is like your normal use kind of thing supposed to understand?
Yep. That's a difficult question to answer. I think legislatures have done a lot of work in making legislation more readable. I think they still have a long way to go. And one of the fundamental problems in a common law jurisdiction like ours, you can't just read legislation on its own. You've got to read it together with the judicial decisions interpreting legislation, which don't always follow exactly what a sort of naive reading of the text would lead you to conclude. So I think short of changing that common law sort of balance between the courts and the legislature, I don't think we're going to address that easily. I did talk about this a little in the paper. I think law schools and organisations like Osley, Bailey, Cornell Law Legal Information Institute have a very important role to play there because they're independent. Government shouldn't interpret its own legislation. They should leave that to other people. I think that's a fundamental separation of powers issue. Yes, Cornell Legal Information. Go to law.cornell.edu, and they do a lot of work on that and have done a lot of research into that area.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you.
And we're going to move on now to Margaret Phillips, who is speaking to hers and Adrian Cunningham's paper on keeping electronic information accessible. I'm going to do a quick technology change. Do you want us to save your changes? Now, Margaret, I have to leave the room for approximately 2 minutes. Is that okay with you? I'll be straight back. I'm going to hand over to Margaret. I have to very rarely leave the room for all of 2 minutes, but I'll keep my eye on myself.
I'm warned. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to talk to you today about the importance of keeping this information available online. It's published, but we have to keep it. And that's my very strong interest. Since the 1980s, as we all know, increasing amounts of information have been made available online, created, stored and distributed. Well, not just online, in a variety of electronic formats, including floppy disks, CDs, more recently DVDs, and now also on the internet and intranets. And all of these different formats contain information that may be important for e-democracy. But it's the internet and the World Wide Web most particularly, that have the greatest impact, I believe, to impact on the ability of citizens to get the information that they need to participate in democracies in an electronic world. Now, the focus of this paper, which has been developed both by the National Library. I work at the National Library of Australia, and the co-author, Adrian Cunningham, works at the National Archives of Australia. Our focus is information made available online via the internet, what I would define as publications, information made available online via intranets, particularly government agency intranets, or in other words, organisational records, and the role of libraries and archives in collecting, managing and preserving this information for online access, for long-term access. Now, I'm primarily dealing here with government information, publications and organisational records, but by no means excluding information that is created, sometimes published, not always published, by other bodies such as universities. A lot of important research information comes out of universities and associated agencies that is important for the democratic process. It's not just government information that is critical to that. So a couple of definitions now. What is an online publication? What is an online record? In theory, an online publication is everything made publicly available on the internet. A very daunting prospect for libraries, I can assure you. In practice, the National Library selectively archives certain types of online publications, and we've detailed those in our paper, and I refer you to the paper for quite a bit more detailed information. But they include e-journals and other serials, research papers, conference proceedings, and websites or parts of websites which provide substantial or unique information about a topic, organisation or person. A record, and this is a definition from Standards Australia in 2002, a record is information created, received and maintained as evidence and information by an organisation or person in pursuance of legal obligations or in the transaction of business. In the online world, this includes emails and websites both on the internet and intranets. In the mid-1990s, both publications and records started to appear online. In April 2000, Government Online, the Commonwealth Government's strategy, was issued. And this stipulated that all new, non-commercial publications released by a minister or an agency must be made available online concurrently with other forms, so print or CD-ROM, from the 1st of June 2000. So effectively, the online version of a government publication became the primary format. Other information services were to be made available by December of 2000. So this led to a huge increase in the amount of online publishing by government. Now, from statistics produced from our National Bibliographic Database, that's the database of catalogue records from libraries around Australia, it would appear that about half of all government publications are now published online only, so no print version, no CD-ROM, available online only. In practice, I think the percent is likely to be higher because our procedures for contributing catalogue records for print publications to the National Bibliographic Database are much more entrenched, much more likely to be observed than they are for online publications. So this has quite serious implications for the availability long term of government information. Now, the role of deposit libraries in collecting, describing and preserving government information or anything published within the jurisdiction, be it the nation or the state, has always been central to making information available to citizens, to the community. And in the print world, this role was supported by legal deposit provisions. The role of documenting the national output enables researchers to find what has been published and to gain access to it. At this stage, legal deposit does not apply to online publications, to electronic publications. In fact, it doesn't even apply to microfiche or microfilm. At the Commonwealth level, it applies only to printed material. So this makes them much more difficult for libraries to identify and collect. The situation is slightly different at the state level. We've seen in the previous presentation how Tasmania is very much at the fore in terms of publishing legislation. They are very much to the fore in this field too. They have legislation which does cover online publications. South Australia does as well. Now, the role of national and state archives in this area. Archives in democracies are meant to help protect the rights and entitlements of the governed, as well as being places of scholarly research and sources of national and cultural memory. To support these roles, evidence of government decisions and activities, including online activities, need to be captured and preserved in an accessible form for as long as needed, and sometimes that's indefinitely. The National Archives promotes best practice through standards and guidelines in the management of government information in all formats, from point of creation for as long as required. The Australian Government has recognised the importance of the Archives standards and guidelines by making compliance with them mandatory. So what makes online information so vulnerable? There are technical, organisational, legal, financial and political factors at play here. We'll go through them. Technically, electronic publications and records are not readable by the human eye without the aid of machines and computer programs. Over time, the machines and programs used for the creation, storage and distribution of these documents change, become obsolete, and documents created using that particular kind of software will not be interpretable. Preserving the ability to interpret and render information in electronic formats is a very complex and expensive task, and there are no known reliable strategies yet for doing this. There are theories about how to do it, there are ways of doing it in some situations, but there's no overall way of preserving information or access to this information in electronic formats. It's likely that there'll be a suite of strategies that need to be applied, especially in the area of complex digital objects, such as the ones we find published on the web. And these strategies are labour-intensive, time-consuming and costly. Now, there are organisational factors as well. Keeping online information available requires complex human and technical systems. It requires organisational commitment to funding, infrastructure, staff training, standards and guidelines. And this commitment is often lacking. Organisations that own information are impermanent. They restructure their websites, have name changes, and in some cases are abolished. It's quite ironic that the National Office for the Information Economy is in that category at this very minute. An organisation may cease a function or transfer it elsewhere, as we're seeing with NOE. In universities and research centres, funding for a research program comes to an end. The researcher retires and the information, the data that may have been generated by that research program is in electronic limbo, unless the deposit of that and the caretaking of that electronic information is negotiated with an appropriate archives or library. Devolution of publishing, of responsibility for publishing within government departments, the outsourcing of creation of information and publication has made it difficult for departments and libraries to know what is being published. Some of my colleagues who work in government agencies lament that they can't find out even what their own department is publishing, let alone anybody else out in the general community. There are legal factors. I've mentioned that legal deposit legislation does not yet cover online publishing. Two states, though, New South Wales and Western Australia, have Premier's directives or circulars that make it mandatory for government agencies to deposit with their state libraries. It's interesting to note that the New South Wales directive emphasises the value of government information and the key roles of libraries in providing access to it. There are a number of Commonwealth Acts that together promote accountability for government records. Adrian has detailed those in our paper, and I refer you to the paper. I don't have time to go into that now. The National Archives, though, has little power to require government agencies to comply with best practice record-keeping standards, and consequently compliance is uneven. Financial factors. Implementing new systems for creation and management of online records and publications is very costly. The national, state and territory libraries have been granted no additional funding to undertake collection and preservation of online publications, and resources are woefully insufficient. Likewise, the National Archives and government agencies have had no additional funding for this new area of responsibility. National Archives and the National Library have both set up new branches to administer the electronic records and electronic publications. But to do this, we've had to snitch little bits of money from other parts of the organisation, of the organisations to do this, and that's not a satisfactory way of doing things. And finally, political factors. Governments change, policies change. Information previously available can embarrass a government, a party or an individual. Online information can easily be changed, accidentally, intentionally, even maliciously. So both the National Library and the National Archives have made considerable attempts to seriously address these issues. And I would say that both organisations are well known internationally for these initiatives. They've been of world leading class rather than just nationally. The National Library has set up Pandora, Australia's web archive, which is an archive now containing about 5,500 titles, 40% of which are government publications, not just Commonwealth, but state as well. And we have set up a program to identify, select, describe and store these online publications, many of which have now disappeared from the web. And So this archive contains the only extant version of these publications. However, it's a very time-consuming process. At this point in time, we can only collect title by title. Particularly for government publications, we need the facility to batch load publications, to identify the fact that the Defence Department has in the last month published 200 publications, take them in, not identifying them one by one. And so we've started working with individual government agencies to identify ways of getting their metadata into our system and using the system to automatically go out to their site and download it into the archive. We've started working with ways of archiving databases. A lot of government information is published in database format. Our processes so far, and this is the case around the world, for getting material into the archive is sending out harvesting robots. And that requires the ability to follow HTML links. Databases cannot be accessed in that way, and so we're currently involved in a research project with the Bibliothèque Nationale through the International Internet Preservation Consortium to find ways of archiving databases, and that's going to be a very important step forward for us in the next 12 to 18 months, and we'll share that information with national libraries around the world. The National Library is also participating in some ARC research, ARC-funded projects that are looking at how to get university-published information into repositories, to find ways of discovering what's in those repositories and for keeping track of the metadata. The National Archives initiatives have included the e-permanence suite of best practice record-keeping standards. They have endorsed and promoted the Australian Standards for Record Management, that's ISO 15489. They've published the Dirks Manual, which details how government records should be kept, what can be disposed of, etc. They've been very important in devising the AGLS metadata standard, and this is a metadata standard, one of the few standards around the world that is an implementation of the Dublin Core metadata standard. More details about that in the paper. And they have also a new and a very important digital preservation project. They have developed some software called Xena, which converts government records into XML, or extensible markup language, and preserves it in that form. It will make it readily interpretable by future computer programs. Oh, I've missed the National Archives points there on the PowerPoint. Now, there are some key factors which are inhibiting long-term availability to online information. One is the low level of recognition among creators, publishers, agencies and politicians of the importance of long-term access. The lack of a national strategy for retaining online national heritage. The lack of adequate funding for preservation, and the absence of legal deposit for online publications. Absence of whole-of-government framework for managing Australian government digital information resources. Short-term focus means insufficient attention to future needs for evidence, accountability and documentary heritage. There is a perception that record keeping is an overhead that should be minimised. Overhead should be minimised. That's a guiding principle, but this isn't one of them. It's core business. the perception that good record keeping is just a case of buying the right software. So, in conclusion, keeping information in online formats available for e-governance and e-democracy is a public good, just as health services, education and bridges are. Increasingly in the future, the preservation of other public goods will depend on the long-term availability of online information. This must be recognised, and the cost of it must be borne by Australian society as a whole. Previous speaker emphasised the need for society to bear the cost of publication of legislation. I argue the need for society as a whole to bear the cost of preservation of this information. Information that's critical to e-governance and e-democracy in Australia is in danger of being lost. There's an urgent need for politicians, heads of government departments and other key policy makers, educators, publishers, academics and the general public to realise the magnitude and gravity of this situation. And this is not to say that the situation in Australia is any worse than in any other country. In fact, Australia is better positioned than most other countries to move quickly if the political will is there. We have the technical infrastructure, we have expertise, and other countries are seeking this expertise that we have developed. So we have it in hand. We are seriously disadvantaged by the absence of legal deposit legislation. The UK and New Zealand have both within the last 18 months or so introduced legislation, and so they're ahead of us in this area. A national strategy for the collection and preservation of online information is required. It must encompass government, education, commercial and private sectors. This strategy must assign responsibilities where they haven't already been assumed. And this legislation must be supported by appropriate funding. We have agencies, the National Archives, the National Library, which have assumed responsibility, but we don't have funding, and this is a very crucial aspect of a national strategy that must be put in place. Thank you.
Margaret, I'll go straight back to my office and downloading all of my publications into the University's digital archive.
Great.
Yes, I've got a question both for Margaret, probably also for Tim. In terms of, you talked about best practice, both of you talked about best practice in producing electronic information. I'd be interested in your comments on the appropriate electronic format. I was well aware, as part of this push of the government to get everything available online, for example, the Australian Immunisation Handbook was put online in accord with government requirements. The 2 megabyte PDF file, which was unsearchable, not indexed, and if you searched the government's Department of Health website, you could not find any reference to any information in it whatsoever. But undoubtedly they had done the minister's bidding of having it online. It does seem to me that having it online also means that it should be usable. And would you agree that, you know, an XML format, text with markup is probably the most useful format in which we should be encouraging our government officials to put things online?
Well, the National Archives and the National Library don't really promulgate any particular formats, or at least the National Library doesn't. I'm not quite sure about the National Archives. The National Archives approach is to convert from the formats that publishers are using into formats that they can support in the future. The National Library's approach is not to do that because well, we've decided that it's important for the kinds of publications that we're taking in to take them in as they are published and to tackle the preservation problem, I'll use that word, separately. obviously, the more simply the information is presented, the simpler our task is as well. But we believe we have to be responsive to the way that information is being published. Publishers naturally want to use cutting-edge technology to present their materials in what they hope will be the most eye-catching or interesting ways. So we don't specify publication formats. But your point about, government agencies do have a responsibility to make their information usable, findable. That's one of our difficulties in the digital archiving section at the National Library, is to actually find the information that governments are publishing.
Tim, did you want to respond to that as well?
I'll just briefly, the issue of PDF, and I made a disparaging remark to the PDF just sort of on the by. Mainly because of, it's basically electronic print. And in fact, I think the Victorian standards, the Victorian archive, what are they called? Actually dictate that they convert their electronic documents into PDF, which is just, I won't even go there. It's a silly thing to do because you can't get them back out again, except as effectively paper. Whereas with the cost of converting to, say, XML is actually quite high, though. And perhaps the best solution is to preserve the original format and produce a second byproduct which is accessible to the extent possible with current technology, because down the track, converting to more accessible XML will undoubtedly be cheaper and more effective. Whereas converting to PDF to that will invariably be harder than converting a, say, a Word document.
Question, comment from Tony down the front?
It's probably more comment than anything else, but I do think it would be great to see someone like the National Library take a good stand on it. But that conversion into XML, which is essentially a basic source document, provides enormous opportunity for searching, but conversion into whatever form that people choose to access it, whether that be an online rendering, whether that be rendering into Braille, large print, standard print, all the glossies, none of the glossies, whatever. It would just be a tremendous step forward, because the vast majority of the government materials are available in PDF, which it's just horrendous.
Can I just make a comment on that? That our commitment is to collect and preserve publications with the look and feel that the publisher presents. So if they present us with difficult formats, our attempt will be to collect and preserve them.
I just wanted to support what Margaret just said, in fact, that often if we're preserving something in a library, a historian wants to know exactly what it was like when it first came out. The original feel, the original structure, the original format actually says a lot about people who produced it and about the time at which it was produced. Converting something to XML may be good for now and it may be good for the future, but it takes away that exact point in time when it was produced.
In effect, we might find that we have to do both, but to preserve the content, and some of the content is more important. It depends on the publication. Sometimes, a given publication, it's the look and feel that's really important to you. Some publications we identify and collect just because they are cutting-edge technology in the way they present information on the web. In other cases, a government report in PDF, it's not the look and feel that matters, it's the content. So we may find that we have to do both. Both preserve the look and feel, and where that's important, and in other cases convert to something like XML just to preserve the content.
I'm going to take one more question up the back and then encourage us all to take this conversation into the lunch area.
I have a different question for Tony. At a local government level, there's been independents voting through postal voting. I wonder if you could comment on those two options, if they're appropriate or not.
They're actually, attendance, postal voting is actually quite, if you are intending that you are to cast a vote by secretly applying yourself, then those systems are inherently discriminatory, if you like, because going to require somebody to actually fill it in on behalf of them. The shift for that has predominantly been, certainly I think in Victoria, a cost issue more than anything else. And really there does need to be some consideration about what options can be put in place to allow people to access it. EMAX might be a solution. It's certainly probably a feasible one because we're only talking about setting things up in local, distinct, strategically placed areas. Again, that's something that needs to be worked on as well. But I'm hopeful that if we can get something set up in state, a couple of places, that there'll be some flow-on effects.
Can I ask everyone to thank all the speakers at this stage? Thanks very much for diverse presentations, but all dealing with the usability of technology, which is really good. And more questions out in lunch area. The next session is starting at 5:00. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jan.
Would you like it? Yeah.
Different from the other
Thank you very much. We've actually done this. We've been great stuff the last 5 years.
One of the things we're doing, we generate this SGML knowledge project. And then from that, produce.
Oh, right, okay.
For a fraction of the street, nothing. Office 2003 which is fairly presentation oriented. All the documents. So we have a fairly controlled web environment that
Oh, no, that's fine. I wouldn't do that. I'll just do the pinball. Bounce around. But yeah, that'd be good. I like to see that in a couple of times. Yeah, are you guys here in Melbourne? Yeah, okay. Where are you based? We're here in Melbourne. Still down the road. Victoria Street. Yeah, look, I'll touch base. We've got a couple of minutes. Sure. No, that'd be very good to see. Because I think this sort of application is just the most way to go. Yes. I understand that.
Well, I actually think that both are really important. And with XML, that's what Chrome can actually do.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And you can generate the people who are working
as it originally was. Absolutely.
But really, we're searching and indexing and we're on this structured markup. Excellent. That's good.
Tony, I'm Lisa. I asked you a question about the survey. I work for that have actually